The concrete was still wet when Margaret discovered what Grandpa Joe had done to her precious Tesla. I watched from my kitchen window as she stood in that parking lot, screaming like a banshee at what used to be the interior of her $80,000 car. Now it looked like a modern art sculpture titled, "When Bullies Meet Consequences." Her voice carried across 3 city blocks as she realized every seat, every control panel, every piece of her spotless white Model S was now permanently encased in gray concrete. The same concrete that would never come out. The same concrete that would cost her more money than she had spent trying to destroy my life. But let me back up, because this story does not start with revenge. It starts with a peaceful morning on my ranch, before I knew that one woman's need for control would nearly cost me everything I loved. That morning, I had no idea that within 6 months, my 78-year-old grandfather would become the most creative vigilante this county had ever seen. The sun was just breaking over the hills when I stepped onto my wraparound porch with my first cup of coffee. This was my favorite time of day on the ranch. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sounds of my horses nickering in the pasture and my chickens clucking around their coop. 40 acres of pure peace, inherited from my grandmother 3 years ago when she passed. I walked down the gravel path toward the barn, boots crunching softly on the stones. My old border collie, Rex, trotted beside me as we made our morning rounds. The horses came running when they saw me approaching with their hay. Thunder, my paint gelding, nudged my shoulder with his nose while I filled the water troughs. These simple moments made all the stress of my job in town worth it. My grandmother had built this ranch in 1952 with my grandfather. They raised cattle, grew vegetables, and lived the kind of honest life that seems impossible today. When she left it to me, I promised her I would keep it exactly as she intended. A working ranch, not some suburban showpiece. The property sat on a hill overlooking what used to be farmland. But in the past 5 years, everything had changed. Developers had bought up the surrounding acres and built Sunset Valley, a planned community with identical houses, manicured lawns, and rules for everything. The HOA had tried to extend their boundaries to include my ranch, but my lawyer made it clear that my property predated their community by 70 years. I did not mind having neighbors. What I minded was the way some of them looked at my place, like it was some kind of eyesore that needed fixing. My barn was not painted the approved HOA colors. My fence was wood instead of vinyl. My driveway was gravel instead of concrete. But none of that mattered because I was not part of their association. At least, that is what I thought. Grandpa Joe emerged from the guest cabin where he had been living since Grandma died. At 78, he was still strong as an ox from 50 years in construction. His morning routine never changed. Coffee, newspaper, and a slow walk around the property to check on things. He had built half the buildings in this county and knew more about property rights than most lawyers. "Morning, kiddo," he called out, his voice gravelly from decades of shouting over construction noise. "Looks like we got company again." I followed his gaze toward the road. A white Tesla was parked on the shoulder, and I could see someone inside taking pictures of my property with a phone. This had been happening more often lately. Cars would drive slowly past my fence, their occupants staring and pointing like I was running some kind of illegal operation. "Probably just curious about the horses," I said, but something in my gut told me it was more than that. Grandpa Joe squinted at the car. "That is the third time this week. Same white car, same time of morning." The Tesla pulled away as soon as the driver noticed us watching, but I had a feeling we would be seeing more of that car, and whoever was driving it. I finished my morning chores and headed inside to get ready for work. As I drove my old pickup truck past the HOA entrance, I noticed several residents standing in their driveways, coffee cups in hand, watching me drive by. Their expressions were not friendly. Something was building. I could feel it in the way people looked at my truck, my work clothes, my ranch. They saw something that did not fit their perfect little world. And I was about to learn just how far some people will go to eliminate what they see as a problem. Her name was Margaret Thornfield, and she ruled the Sunset Valley HOA like a medieval queen ruling her kingdom. I learned this the hard way when she finally worked up the courage to approach me directly. It was a Saturday morning when I first met her face to face. I was repairing a section of fence near the road when I heard footsteps on gravel behind me. I turned to see a woman in her early 50s walking toward me with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. She wore expensive workout clothes and pristine white sneakers that had clearly never touched actual dirt. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, and she carried herself like someone who expected the world to rearrange itself for her convenience. The white Tesla parked on the shoulder told me this was my mystery photographer. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone addressing a servant. "I am Margaret Thornfield, president of the Sunset Valley Homeowners Association. I need to speak with you about your property." I set down my hammer and faced her. "Good morning. I am assuming you are the one who has been taking pictures of my ranch." Her smile was sharp as a knife. "I have been documenting several concerns that affect our community property values. Your fence line appears to encroach on HOA common areas, and there are questions about your compliance with county regulations for livestock operations." I felt my jaw tighten. "Ma'am, this ranch has been in my family for over 70 years. My property lines were surveyed and recorded long before your development existed, and my livestock operation is fully licensed and inspected by the county." Margaret's eyes narrowed. Property values in Sunset Valley average $400,000 per home. When potential buyers see this, she gestured dismissively at my barn and pasture, it creates concerns about the neighborhood character. "My property is not part of your neighborhood," I said, keeping my voice level. "Your HOA has no authority here." That is when her mask slipped. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Community standards apply to everyone in this area, whether they want to acknowledge it or not. Your presence affects all of us, and we have rights too." She pulled out her phone and started taking more pictures, this time of me directly. "I will be attending the next county commissioners' meeting to discuss your impact on our community. I suggest you start thinking about how you can be a better neighbor." I watched her walk back to her Tesla, my blood pressure rising with each step. This woman had just threatened me on my own property, acting like she owned the entire county. But she had made one critical mistake. She had assumed I would be intimidated by her confidence and her threats. Over the next few days, I did some research on Margaret Thornfield. What I learned explained everything. Recently divorced after 20 years of marriage, she had moved to Sunset Valley from Dallas with a settlement that set her up for life. She had no job, no children at home, and unlimited time to focus on controlling every detail of her new environment. The HOA presidency was not just a volunteer position for her. It was her entire identity. She attended every county meeting, filed complaints about noise violations, and had personally written 17 new community regulations in her first year as president. She was the kind of person who measured her neighbor's grass height with a ruler and issued violations for mailbox colors. But the most telling detail was what I learned from my mail carrier. Margaret had been asking questions about my property for months. She wanted to know about my water rights, my septic system, my livestock permits, and anything else that might give her leverage. She was not just a nosy neighbor. She was building a case. That evening, I told Grandpa Joe about my encounter with Margaret. He listened quietly, his weathered hands folded on the kitchen table. "Sounds like she has too much time and too much money," he said finally. "That is a dangerous combination in a woman with control issues." I had no idea how right he was. Margaret Thornfield was not just a pushy HOA president. She was a woman who saw my ranch as a personal insult to her vision of suburban perfection. And she was about to show me exactly how far she would go to eliminate that insult. The war for my ranch was about to begin. The first official complaint arrived on a Tuesday morning. County Code Enforcement, claiming they received reports of illegal livestock operations and unsanitary conditions on my property. The letter demanded a full inspection within 10 days or face potential fines and legal action. I knew exactly who had filed the complaint. Margaret had made good on her threat to involve the county, but she had picked the wrong battle. My ranch was cleaner and better maintained than most of the suburban lawns in her precious neighborhood. The inspection took half a day off work. The county officer, a nice man named Tom Rodriguez, walked through my entire property with a checklist. He examined my horse stalls, checked my feed storage, tested my water systems, and reviewed all my permits and licenses. "Everything looks perfect," he told me as we finished up. "Cleanest operation I have seen in years. Whoever called this in was either misinformed or had other motives." But Margaret was just getting started. The complaints kept coming, each one more creative than the last. Anonymous reports about noise violations from my roosters crowing at dawn. Claims that my horses were malnourished and neglected. Accusations that my farm equipment was damaging county roads. Each complaint meant more time off work, more meetings with officials, more stress. And each time the inspectors found nothing wrong. But Margaret did not care about the results. She cared about the harassment. The psychological warfare escalated when she organized what she called a neighborhood watch program. Suddenly, every delivery truck, every visitor, every time I started my tractor became a subject of surveillance. HOA residents would stand at their property lines with cameras, documenting everything that happened on my ranch. Margaret herself became a daily presence. She would drive slowly past my property multiple times each day, sometimes stopping to take pictures or make notes on her phone. She started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my mailbox about responsible pet ownership and maintaining property values for the community. The notes were always signed, "A concerned neighbor," but her handwriting was distinctive. Neat, precise, and filled with the kind of condescending language that made my skin crawl. One morning, I found her actually on my property, using a surveyor's wheel to measure distances from my fence to the road. When I confronted her, she claimed she was verifying property boundaries for the county. "Get off my land," I told her, my patience finally snapping. "You have no right to be here." She looked at me with that same cold smile. "I have every right to protect my community from property violations. Your fence may be encroaching on public right-of-way." That was when I called the sheriff. Deputy Williams arrived within 20 minutes and politely, but firmly explained to Margaret that she was trespassing on private property. She left, but not before making it clear that this was far from over. The final straw came on a Thursday afternoon. I was at work when my neighbor called to tell me that animal control was at my ranch. Margaret had filed a complaint claiming my horses were severely neglected and needed immediate rescue. I raced home to find two animal control officers examining my horses with a veterinarian. Thunder and the other horses were healthy, well-fed, and clearly cared for. But I had to endure 2 hours of questions, paperwork, and stress while they completed their investigation. "These are some of the healthiest horses I have seen," the vet told me privately. "Whoever called this in was either lying or has no idea what horse neglect actually looks like." That night, Grandpa Joe found me sitting on the porch, staring out at the pasture where my horses grazed peacefully in the evening light. The stress was eating at me. Every day brought new harassment, new complaints, new battles to fight. "She was here again today," Grandpa Joe said quietly, settling into the chair beside me. "Saw her car parked on the county road around midnight, sitting there with her lights off." My blood ran cold. She was here at midnight. Walked right up to the barn with her phone light, looking around like she owned the place. I was about to go talk to her when she heard me coming and ran back to her car. Margaret Thornfield had crossed a line. She was no longer just filing complaints or making threats. She was trespassing on my property in the middle of the night, looking for ammunition to use against me. The woman was unhinged, and I was about to learn just how dangerous an unhinged person with unlimited time and money could be. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a warm Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was mucking out horse stalls when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the barn window, I saw Margaret approaching with 3 other people I recognized as HOA board members. She marched toward me like a general leading troops into battle. Her face was flushed with excitement and righteous anger. Behind her, the other board members looked uncomfortable, like they were not entirely sure they wanted to be part of whatever Margaret had planned. "We are here for an official HOA inspection of this property," Margaret announced loudly enough for half the county to hear. "We have received multiple complaints about violations that affect our entire community." I set down my pitchfork and walked out of the barn to meet them. "Good afternoon, Margaret. You and your friends need to leave my property immediately." Her smile was triumphant. "We have community rights to inspect properties that impact our neighborhood values. Your refusal to cooperate only proves you have something to hide." One of the board members, a nervous-looking man in his 60s, stepped forward. "Maybe we should just talk to the county about this instead of—" "No," Margaret cut him off sharply. "We are handling this today, right now." She started walking toward my horse barn like she owned the place. I moved to block her path. "You have no legal authority here," I said firmly. "This is private property and you are trespassing." That is when Margaret completely lost it. Her voice rose to a shriek that probably frightened wildlife for miles around. "You selfish, arrogant man. Do you have any idea what you are doing to our property values? Do you know what people say when they drive through our beautiful neighborhood and see this? This farm disaster." She was waving her arms wildly, spittle flying from her mouth as she screamed. "Your disgusting animals, your falling down buildings, your junk trucks and tractors. You are destroying everything we have worked to build here." The other board members were backing away, clearly embarrassed by her behavior. But Margaret was just getting started. "I will sue you into bankruptcy," she screamed, her face turning purple with rage. "I will have this property condemned. I will contact every media outlet in the state until everyone knows what kind of selfish pig you are." She started advancing on me again, and I realized this woman had completely snapped. This was not about property values or community standards. This was about a person who could not handle anyone refusing to submit to her control. That is when Grandpa Joe appeared. He walked out of the guest cabin with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had dealt with plenty of bullies in his 78 years. His presence immediately changed the energy of the situation. Even Margaret stopped screaming for a moment. "Ma'am," Grandpa Joe said in his gravelly voice, "you need to get off our property right now." Something about his tone, the quiet authority of a man who had supervised construction crews for 50 years, made the other board members start moving toward their cars. But Margaret was too far gone to recognize the warning. "You cannot intimidate me, old man," she screeched. "I know my rights. I will not be bullied by some hick family who thinks they can ignore community standards." She actually tried to push past both of us toward the barn. That is when I realized she was not just unhinged. She was dangerous. Grandpa Joe stepped between Margaret and the barn entrance. "Last warning, lady. Leave now, or I call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing." Margaret's response was to have a complete emotional breakdown right there in my driveway. She started crying and screaming at the same time, calling us names that would make a sailor blush. She pounded on the hood of my pickup truck with her fists, leaving dents in the metal. "You will pay for this," she howled. "I will make your life a living hell. You have no idea who you are dealing with." The whole meltdown was captured on my security cameras. 20 minutes of a grown woman having a toddler-style tantrum because someone dared to tell her no. Her own board members were so horrified they left without her, forcing Margaret to drive herself home while still sobbing hysterically. After she finally left, Grandpa Joe and I stood in the sudden silence of my driveway, staring at the dents in my truck hood. "That woman is not right in the head," he said quietly. I nodded, still shaken by the intensity of her rage. "I think we need to be prepared for this to get worse." Grandpa Joe's expression was grim as he looked toward the road where Margaret's Tesla had disappeared. "Oh, it will get worse. People like that do not just give up and go away. They double down." He was right. Margaret Thornfield had just declared war on my family and my ranch, and she was about to show me exactly what a person with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries could do to destroy someone's life. The lawsuit papers arrived exactly 1 week after Margaret's meltdown. Thornfield versus Henderson, filed in county court, demanding $50,000 in damages for property value diminishment, and a court order restricting my agricultural activities. I sat at my kitchen table, reading through page after page of legal accusations. According to Margaret's lawyer, my ranch was a public nuisance that created environmental hazards, noise pollution, and unsanitary conditions that damaged the entire Sunset Valley community. Every single claim was false, but proving that in court would cost me thousands of dollars I did not have. I hired the best attorney I could afford, a woman named Sarah Martinez who specialized in property rights cases. She took one look at the lawsuit and shook her head. "This is harassment disguised as litigation," she told me. "The problem is, defending against harassment still costs money. Even when you win, you lose." The legal battle consumed my life for the next 4 months. Depositions, document requests, court filings, and attorney meetings. Every week brought new expenses and new stress. Margaret had unlimited resources to pursue this case, while I was draining my savings account just to defend myself. But Margaret was not content to limit her attacks to the courtroom. She escalated her harassment campaign to a whole new level. She started targeting my ranch business directly. I had been boarding horses for neighbors and friends for years, a small income stream that helped cover feed and maintenance costs. Margaret found out about my clients and began contacting them directly. She left negative reviews on every online platform she could find, claiming my facility was unsafe and unsanitary. She created fake social media accounts to spread lies about horse neglect and property violations. Within 2 months, I had lost half my boarding clients. The psychological warfare got worse. Margaret began driving past my property multiple times each day, honking her horn and shouting insults from her car window. She would park on the county road and just sit there for hours, watching my house like some kind of stalker. The breaking point came when she started blocking my driveway during feed deliveries. She would position her Tesla right across my entrance, claiming she was monitoring traffic violations and protecting community access roads. When the feed truck could not deliver, my horses did not eat. When the veterinarian could not reach my property, my animals did not get medical care. Margaret was using her car as a weapon to harm innocent animals, all to force me into submission. I called the sheriff every time, but the response was always the same. By the time deputies arrived, Margaret would be gone. She was too smart to get caught in the act, and too connected to face real consequences. The final straw came when Margaret filed a restraining order against me. She claimed I had threatened her with physical violence and engaged in stalking behavior. According to her sworn statement, I was a dangerous man who posed a threat to her safety and the entire neighborhood. It was all lies, but the judge granted a temporary restraining order anyway, forcing me to stay 500 feet away from Margaret and her property. Since she lived in the neighborhood directly adjacent to my ranch, this meant I could not even drive past the HOA entrance without risking arrest. I was now a prisoner on my own property, legally prohibited from accessing half the roads in my own county, because a vindictive woman had convinced a judge that I was dangerous. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a stack of legal bills and a nearly empty bank account, wondering how my life had spiraled so far out of control. 6 months ago, I had been living peacefully on my family ranch. Now I was facing bankruptcy, legal persecution, and complete isolation from my community. Grandpa Joe found me there at 2 in the morning, head in my hands, finally broken by months of relentless harassment. "I do not know how much more of this I can take," I admitted to him. "She has unlimited money, unlimited time, and the system is designed to protect people like her. How do you fight someone who can afford to destroy you just for fun?" Grandpa Joe poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. His weathered face was thoughtful as he studied the legal documents scattered across the table. "You know, kiddo," he said slowly, "I have been in construction for 50 years, built everything from houses to highways, and I learned something important about dealing with problems." He looked up at me with eyes that held decades of hard-won wisdom. "Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes lawyers and judges and police cannot fix what is broken. And sometimes, when dealing with bullies who have more power than sense, you have to get creative." I had no idea what he meant, but I was about to find out. Grandpa Joe spent the next 2 weeks studying Margaret's routine like a military strategist planning an invasion. He would sit on the porch with his morning coffee and binoculars, noting every detail of her daily schedule. "Tuesday and Thursday mornings," he told me one evening. "Hot yoga class at the fancy studio downtown. Parks in the same spot every time. Leaves the sunroof cracked open because she thinks fresh air is healthy." I was too exhausted from the legal battle to pay much attention to his surveillance activities. My attorney had just informed me that Margaret was demanding another $50,000 in damages, claiming the stress of our dispute had caused her emotional trauma requiring therapy. But Grandpa Joe was focused on something else entirely. 2 hours and 15 minutes, he continued. Every Tuesday and Thursday, that white Tesla sits in the same parking spot for exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos he had taken of Margaret's car. The sunroof was indeed cracked open about 6 inches, just enough to let air circulate inside the vehicle. You know what I used to do when I ran into problems that could not be solved with paperwork? He asked me. I shook my head, still not understanding where this was going. I solved them with concrete. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. Grandpa Joe had kept his connections in the construction industry, men who had worked with him for decades and trusted his judgment completely. When he explained that we were dealing with a bully who was destroying our family, they did not ask questions. On a Tuesday morning in late November, while Margaret was inside the yoga studio working on her flexibility, a concrete mixer truck pulled up next to her Tesla in the parking lot. Grandpa Joe had positioned himself across the street with a clear view of the operation. He gave me a play-by-play later, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a job well done. The crew worked with military precision. They backed the mixer truck up to Margaret's car, extended the chute directly over her cracked sunroof, and began pouring liquid concrete into the interior of her precious vehicle. The concrete flowed like thick gray milk, filling every space inside that Tesla. The front seats, the back seats, the dashboard, the center console, the footwells, the electronics. Everything Margaret touched when she drove was now encased in permanent, immovable concrete. They filled that car until concrete was pressing against the windows from the inside. The entire interior became one solid block of gray stone, perfectly molded to the shape of Margaret's luxury vehicle. The operation took exactly 18 minutes. By the time Margaret emerged from her yoga class, feeling centered and peaceful, the concrete truck was gone and her Tesla looked normal from the outside. But the moment she opened the driver's door, her world exploded. The screaming could be heard 3 blocks away. Margaret stood in that parking lot, staring at the concrete-filled interior of her $80,000 car, and had the biggest meltdown of her life. She called 911, crying and hyperventilating into the phone about vandalism and destruction of property. She called her insurance company, sobbing about malicious damage and demanding immediate coverage. She called her lawyer, shrieking about lawsuits and criminal charges. But there was nothing anyone could do. The concrete had already cured, bonding permanently with every surface inside her vehicle. Removing it would require completely destroying the car, making it a total loss worth more than most people's annual salary. The security footage from the parking lot showed Margaret's complete breakdown. 20 minutes of crying, screaming, and pounding on the concrete-filled interior of her car. She looked like a child who had just discovered that actions have consequences. When Grandpa Joe told me what he had done, I felt a mix of shock and admiration. This quiet, thoughtful man had delivered perfect justice without breaking any laws or hurting anyone. Margaret's car was not damaged. It was just improved. "How did you know they would not get caught?" I asked him. He smiled. 40 years in construction teaches you a lot about timing and execution. Plus, concrete trucks are everywhere in this county. Nobody pays attention to legitimate construction work. Margaret's insurance company refused to cover the damage. They classified it as intentional vandalism, requiring a police investigation and criminal conviction before any claims could be processed. Since nobody could prove who had done it or how they had gained access to her vehicle, the case went nowhere. She was stuck with a concrete-filled Tesla that could not be driven, could not be repaired, and could not be covered by insurance. Her pride and joy had become a very expensive lawn ornament. But the real beauty of Grandpa Joe's plan was not the financial cost. It was the psychological impact. Margaret Thornfield, the woman who controlled everything in her environment, now owned something she could not control, could not fix, and could not escape from. Every time she looked at that concrete-filled car, she was reminded that there are people in this world who will not be bullied, intimidated, or pushed around. Justice had been served, cold, hard, and permanent as concrete. The change in Margaret was immediate and complete. Within 24 hours of discovering her concrete-filled Tesla, she dropped all lawsuits against me. Her lawyer called my attorney and offered to dismiss the case with prejudice, meaning she could never file the same claims again. The restraining order was withdrawn. The harassment stopped. The daily drive-bys ended. Margaret Thornfield, the woman who had made my life a living hell for 8 months, suddenly became very quiet and very invisible. I learned from my mail carrier that Margaret had tried desperately to find someone who could remove the concrete from her car. She contacted demolition companies, concrete cutting services, and automotive restoration specialists. Every single one told her the same thing. The concrete could not be removed without completely destroying the vehicle. The car had to be towed away as scrap metal. $80,000 worth of luxury electric vehicle, reduced to junk because of 18 minutes of creative justice. But losing the money was not the worst part for Margaret. The worst part was facing her neighbors every day, knowing that everyone in Sunset Valley had heard about her concrete-filled Tesla and her complete meltdown in the yoga studio parking lot. The other HOA board members, embarrassed by months of Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior, called an emergency meeting and voted to remove her as president. They cited conduct unbecoming and misuse of association resources in their official statement. Margaret put her house on the market 2 weeks later. She could not handle the humiliation of staying in a neighborhood where everyone knew she had been outsmarted by an elderly construction worker with a concrete truck. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday. By Friday, Margaret had packed her remaining belongings and moved away, leaving no forwarding address. Her beautiful suburban dream home, with its perfect lawn and HOA-approved paint colors, sat empty while she started over somewhere else. The new HOA president, a reasonable man named David Chen, stopped by my ranch to introduce himself and apologize for Margaret's behavior. He assured me that the association had no interest in interfering with my property rights or agricultural activities. Life returned to normal so gradually that I almost did not notice at first. No more legal papers in the mail, no more harassment complaints, no more strangers taking pictures of my property, no more blocked driveways or midnight surveillance. My boarding clients started returning when the negative online reviews mysteriously disappeared. The horses seemed happier without the constant tension and drama. Even Rex, my old border collie, seemed more relaxed during our morning walks. On a crisp December morning, 6 months after the concrete incident, I sat on my porch with Grandpa Joe, watching the sunrise over our peaceful ranch. The Sunset Valley development sprawled below us, quiet and orderly under new management. "You know," I said to him, "I never did ask you how much that concrete cost." Grandpa Joe smiled and sipped his coffee. "Some things are worth more than money, kiddo. peace of mind, family honor, the right to live on your own land without being bullied. He looked out over the pasture, where my horses grazed contentedly in the morning light. Besides, he added with a twinkle in his eye, I know a guy who owed me a favor. We sat in comfortable silence, enjoying the kind of peace that can only come after surviving a storm. Margaret Thornfield was gone, but the lesson she learned would last forever. Sometimes justice comes from judges and lawyers and official systems, but sometimes it comes from an old man with a concrete truck and the wisdom to know that bullies understand only one language: consequences. The ranch was safe, the family was together, and somewhere in another county, Margaret was learning to live with the knowledge that her actions had consequences she never saw coming. Justice served cold and hard as concrete.